The bread was already in the oven when I reached for my coat. That detail has never left me. I need you to understand that. The bread was already in there, rising in the heat. The whole house carried the smell of yeast and burning wood. I had been standing at the kitchen window for 11 minutes, watching an empty road. I know the exact number because I was counting. Counting is what I do when my hands have nothing useful to hold on to. The road gave me nothing. It was a Tuesday in March. The ground was still locked halfway between frozen and thawed, and the light outside had that flat, gray quality, the color of water that has been used for too many things. I had somewhere I needed to be. My husband was not in the house. He had not told me I was allowed to go. I went anyway. I grew up Old Order Lancaster County, in the kind of community where the bishop's name was spoken in the same breath as God's, and for most of my childhood, it was genuinely difficult to locate the difference between the two. I was 26 years old when I finally walked away. Have you ever spent years living inside a rule you had stopped believing in, simply because the cost of breaking it felt too enormous? I did that. I did it for a long time. And then on one ordinary Tuesday, I didn't. The rule itself was never written down. That is the part that surprises people most when I describe it. There was no list, no document with signatures, no printed code of conduct. It existed in the texture of how women spoke to one another, in the specific quality of silence that filled a room when a wife arrived somewhere by herself, in the way the deacon's wife could communicate an entire verdict with a single look across a gathering. A woman did not leave on her own. Not to town, not to a neighbor's house, not for any stretch of time that mattered. You traveled with your husband, or you remained where you were. If you had a need and he was absent, you waited for him to return. That was the structure of it. That was the shape a life was supposed to take. My husband Jacob was a good man. I want to say that directly and without softening it into something complicated. He never raised a hand to me. He was not someone who took pleasure in cruelty. He worked long days and came home tired in an honest way. He prayed before every meal, and he meant those prayers, genuinely. But there was an entire version of my life over which he held quiet authority, where I went, when I went, who I spent time with, how long I was permitted to stay. No one in our world called that control. The word simply did not attach itself to what we were all living inside. It had no name because it didn't need one. It was just marriage, the particular shape of it in that place. My friend Miriam said something to me that I have never stopped turning over. We were sitting at her kitchen table 7 days before the Tuesday, shelling beans, her youngest child asleep somewhere in the back of the house. I was explaining to her why I couldn't simply go to see my sister in the next county, my sister who was sick, who had asked me to come, who needed me there. I was walking through all the reasons, the timing, Jacob's schedule, how it would appear to people. Miriam set her bowl down on the table. She did not look at me. She looked at her own hands and she said, "Ruth, a woman who cannot walk out her own front door isn't being protected. She's being held." Then she picked her bowl back up and kept working. I said nothing in response. I agreed with her completely and sat there as though I didn't. That was 7 days before I moved. My sister's name is Hannah. Something was happening with her chest, something an English doctor had said needed attention, and she had sent word through a neighbor asking whether I might be able to come. It was not a crisis, but it was not small either. I asked Jacob the same evening her message arrived. He said he wasn't certain about the timing. He told me he would let me know. 3 days passed and he said nothing further. I did not ask again. That restraint is its own kind of education, learning not to repeat a question. You absorb that lesson so gradually that by the time it has fully taken hold, you can no longer remember learning it at all. On that Tuesday, Jacob left early to help a neighbor with fencing work, and would not be back until evening. I stood at the kitchen window and counted 11 minutes. Then I walked to the oven, lowered the temperature just enough that the bread would not burn, pulled on my coat and my black bonnet, walked down to the road, and hired a driver. I want to tell you that what I felt was courage. That is not what I felt. My hands stayed pressed flat against my apron for the entire ride, and I barely produced a word. The driver was an Englishwoman named Patty, who made this run a couple of times each week. She caught my eye once in the rearview mirror and asked me nothing. I had the sense she had carried other women in that seat before. I think she understood. Hannah was going to be fine. We spent 2 hours together. I helped her sort through a few things. We talked about our mother. We ate cold chicken and some bread a neighbor had left on her porch. It was an entirely ordinary afternoon. That is the piece that resists explanation. Nothing occurred that afternoon that would register as justification for dismantling a life. It was just time with my sister. But somewhere on the ride home, on that long, flat, gray stretch of road, something inside me became clear. I had just done something without anyone's permission, something I had every right to do. I had gone to my sick sister. And the fact that my hands had been trembling, the fact that I had needed to count 11 minutes before allowing myself to walk to the end of my own driveway, the fact that it had felt like something I was sneaking rather than something I was simply doing, that was not faithfulness. That was not scripture lived out. That was something else, with a different name. Jacob was home before I arrived. He was standing in the kitchen when I came through the door. The bread had finished baking and was cooling on the rack. He had already cut himself a slice. He looked at me and said, "Where were you?" And it was not a question so much as a measure being taken. I told him I had gone to Hannah. I told him she had asked me to come, and that I had gone. I said it plainly, still in my coat, and I watched something move across his face while he worked out how to respond. He said I should have waited until he had given me the word. And I said, I knew that. But something in the way I said it was different from how I would have said it the week before. Something in me said it like a door being eased shut from the inside, softly and with intention. I did not leave that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think these stories sometimes get shaped into something they aren't. A single confrontation, a bag packed in anger, a clean and dramatic exit. Mine did not move that way. 3 more months went by. The bishop eventually came to our kitchen because Jacob had spoken to someone, and the bishop sat with us and talked about wives and the order God had established and the meaning of submission. I listened. I nodded. But inside, I had already quietly relocated to somewhere he could not reach. I left in June, with a bag and Patty's phone number, which I had held on to. I still think about the bread, how I turned the heat down just slightly before walking out, how some part of me, even inside the act of leaving, was making certain nothing behind me would catch fire. I don't know what to make of that. I'm not sure it carries a meaning beyond itself. But I have never been able to release the image. Me in my coat and my bonnet, adjusting the temperature of an oven in a house I was in the process of leaving forever. Maybe that is simply the kind of person I am. Maybe I was saying a quiet goodbye to something I genuinely loved, even while I was walking out from under what had learned to use it to hold me in place. I am still working out where those two things separate. If you are somewhere in the middle of working that out yourself, say something below. Tell me what you think the bread was. And if these stories are finding you at the right moment, share this one with someone who might need it. There are more I will keep telling, as honestly as I am able.